April 7th, 1972, approximately 4:30 in the morning, 129 Mulberry Street, corner of Hester Street, Little Italy, Manhattan. A restaurant called Umberto's Clam House has been open for exactly 2 months. It does not yet have an alcohol license. Fishing nets and plastic life preservers hang on the walls. The floor is white tile. The owner, Umberto Ianiello, founded it. His son Matthew, known in certain circles as Matty the Horse, is standing at the cash register. A man in a pinstripe suit and a gray fedora walks through the door with his wife of 3 weeks, his 10-year-old stepdaughter, his sister, his bodyguard, and his bodyguard's girlfriend. He has spent the last year trying very hard to stop being the person he used to be. He has been reading philosophy. He has been painting in oils. He has been having dinner with actors and comedians in Greenwich Village and talking about Nietzsche and Machiavelli over clams. He has just come from the Copacabana, where Don Rickles performed to a packed room, and he is 43 years old tonight, which happens also to be the exact age at which he will die, because the morning his birthday ends is the morning the side door opens and 3 men come through it with guns. The man in the pinstripe suit is Joe Gallo, known to the people who feared him as Crazy Joe, known to the people who recently befriended him as something closer to a legend, a Brooklyn gangster who had read his way out of a decade in prison and emerged quoting existentialist philosophy in Greenwich Village apartments. He has been out of prison for less than a year. He has been married for less than a month. He has a stepdaughter who will later become a Broadway performer and a wife who was, until recently, a nun. This is not simply a story about a mob killing. It is a story about a man who changed himself in a way that no one around him was willing to accept. And it is a story about a question that the official record has never answered, a question about whether the order that ended Gallo's life came from the Colombo family, who had every documented reason to want him dead, or from a quiet man in a brick house on a quiet street in northeastern Pennsylvania. This much is certain. Someone made a decision in the hours before dawn on April 7th, 1972, and Joe Gallo never made it past dessert. Before we get into it, if you are watching from somewhere in the world tonight, drop it in the comments. And if this is your first time here, consider subscribing. These stories take months of research to build, and every subscriber makes the next one possible. Now, 1972, Little Italy. Here is what actually happened. The evening begins at the Copacabana on East 60th Street, where comedian Don Rickles is finishing a show, to an audience that includes somewhere in the room a 43-year-old man in a pinstripe suit who has spent the last year trying very hard to stop being the person he used to be. Gallo's party that night includes his new wife Sina, her 10-year-old daughter Lisa, his sister Carmela Fiorello, his bodyguard Pete the Greek Diapolis, and Diapolis's girlfriend, the actor Jerry Orbach, and his wife Marta, the comedian David Steinberg, and a bodyguard named Bobby Darrow. Don Rickles performs on the stage below them and insults the entire room, which is exactly the kind of thing Joe Gallo finds funny in 1972, because Joe Gallo in 1972 was a man who was decided to find everything funny, or at least to perform finding everything funny, because the alternative is to acknowledge that for the better part of a year, he has been walking around New York City with a contract on his life. He looks like he belongs here. The pinstripe suit, the gray fedora, the easy way he occupies the room. Jerry Orbach's wife, Marta, has said that Gallo had absolutely charmed her, which is not something anyone would have said about the man who went into prison in 1961. Gay Talese, one of the great journalists of the era, has said of him, "He almost became one of the beautiful people." When the Copacabana closes around 4 in the morning, Gallo invites Rickles to continue the celebration at a restaurant downtown. Rickles declines. The Orbachs also do not go. Steinberg and Bobby Darrow peel away. The party that continues is smaller. Gallo, Sina, Lisa, Carmela, Pete the Greek, and Pete's girlfriend, climbing into Gallo's black 1971 Cadillac and heading south through Manhattan toward Little Italy. The destination's Umberto's Clam House, a corner restaurant at 129 Mulberry Street that has been open for exactly 2 months. Gallo considers it safe ground. There is an understanding among the major figures of New York organized crime that Little Italy is neutral territory, a place where the ordinary rules of the street are suspended. Umberto's is also, not coincidentally, owned by a man with mob connections, which in its own way feels like additional protection. You do not bleed in a friend's restaurant. The party enters around 4:30. The restaurant is nearly empty. Fishing nets hang on the walls, plastic life preservers, white tile underfoot. Matthew Ianiello stands at the cash register. There is no wine, no liquor, because there is no license for either. The party orders coffee and Coca-Cola and shrimp and scungilli and clams, and they settle at two tables with the easy familiarity of people who have been out all night and arrived somewhere comfortable. And Gallo and Diapolos sit with their backs to the wall facing the room, because even on his birthday, even in neutral territory, even 3 weeks into a marriage that might represent a different life entirely, Joe Gallo sits facing the door. A man at the bar gives the new arrivals a long look. He does not finish his drink. He gets up, leaves without drawing attention, and walks out into the night. Inside, the party is warm. The first plates arrive. The conversation flows. A second helping of seafood is ordered because they have nowhere to be and nowhere they would rather be, and the clams are good, and it is still Gallo's birthday for another hour or so, and the white tile floor of Umberto's clam house is the most peaceful place in Joe Gallo's world at this particular moment. The second helping of clams had just arrived when the side door on Hester Street opened, and 3 men came through it with guns. To understand why 3 men came through that door with guns, you have to go back to 1929, and to Red Hook, Brooklyn, and to a family that treated organized crime the way other families treated a trade. Joe Gallo was born on April 7th, 1929, the second of 3 brothers, to Umberto and Mary Gallo. Red Hook, in the late 1920s and 30s, was a dense, working-class waterfront neighborhood in Brooklyn where poverty and proximity produced a particular kind of ambition. Umberto Gallo had been a bootlegger during Prohibition and used those earnings to finance a loan sharking operation, and he did not particularly discourage his sons from participating in the local criminal economy. Joe had 2 brothers, Larry, the eldest, and Albert, known as Kid Blast. Together, they would become one of the most feared and most destructive criminal crews in New York organized crime history. Gallo was diagnosed with schizophrenia around 1950. He was hospitalized briefly at Kings County Hospital in Brooklyn. The diagnosis did not slow him. If anything, it clarified something about the particular quality of his menace, which was always theatrical, always slightly outside the ordinary register of mob violence. He had discovered the 1947 film Noir Kiss of Death as a young man and modeled himself, deliberately and consciously, on the Richard Widmark character Tommy Udo, a deranged killer with a twitching eye and a habit of laughing at violence. The adopted persona of controlled instability was, for the early part of his career, entirely effective. The Gallo Crew's headquarters was a 3-story brick tenement at 51 Pleasant Street in what is now Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn. They called it the dormitory. It was the center of an operation that included floating dice games, high-stakes card games, extortion rackets, a numbers operation, and reportedly, in the basement, a live lion named Cleo. The lion was not a metaphor. It was a lion. The Gallo brothers worked for the Profaci crime family, one of New York's 5 families, run by Joseph Profaci, a Sicilian immigrant who had built his organization into a substantial Brooklyn criminal empire and was known, not affectionately, as the Olive Oil King. In 1957, according to multiple documented accounts, Gallo and his associate Carmine Persico were involved in the murder of Albert Anastasia, boss of what would become the Gambino crime family, shot in the barber's chair of the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan on October 25, 1957. The killing was allegedly ordered by Profaci himself and paved the way for Carlo Gambino to consolidate power over the New York underworld. What Gallo received in return for this, or whether he received anything, is not established in the record. What is documented is the sense of grievance that followed. The Gallo brothers believed they had done dangerous, loyal, irreversible work for the Profaci organization, and had been denied a fair share of the rewards. Larry Gallo ran the crew's vending machine and jukebox operations. Joe ran the gambling and extortion. Albert provided the muscle. Together they generated substantial revenue for the family, and together they decided, at some point in the late 1950s, that the arrangement was not fair. This was the specific conviction that drove every catastrophe that followed, not ideology, not ambition in the ordinary sense, the specific burning certainty that they had done what was asked of them and had not been paid what they were owed. And Joe Gallo had decided, with the specific confidence of a man who believes violence is a kind of currency, that it was time to collect. 3 hours southwest of Brooklyn, in the anthracite coal country of northeastern Pennsylvania, there was a squat brick house at 304 East Doran Street in a city called Kingston, and inside it lived a man that most people in the outside world had never heard of, and that every significant figure in the American Mafia had heard of, and treated with something close to reverence. His name was Rosario Alberto Bufalino, and he was born on October 29th, 1903, in Montedoro, a hill town in south-central Sicily, to Angelo Bufalino and Cristina Buccoleri. His father immigrated to the United States first, settling in Pittston, Pennsylvania, to work in the coal mines. Bufalino arrived with his mother and siblings through the port of New York in 1906 at age 2 or 3, and grew up in that particular landscape of immigrant Sicilian-American life in northeastern Pennsylvania, where the coal industry shaped everything, where family and clan ties provided the only reliable social infrastructure, and where the criminal world was woven into the legitimate one from the beginning. He spent his early criminal years in Buffalo, New York, where he made connections with figures who would become significant leaders in the Buffalo crime family and other organizations along the East Coast. He married Carolina Sciandra in 1928. She came from a Sicilian Mafia family with roots going back to the earliest days of the American organization. They had no children. He returned to Pennsylvania and settled in Kingston in 1940, operating a series of businesses that appeared entirely legitimate from the outside, most notably the Pen Drape and Curtain Company, a garment operation in the Pittston area. The garment business was not simply a front, though it served that function too. Bufalino's criminal organization had genuine, deep roots in the garment industry, both in northeastern Pennsylvania and in New York City's garment district. The Bufalino family's operations extended into labor racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, and the union structures of northeastern Pennsylvania's coal industry and garment trade. The territory under his control ran from Pittston, Scranton, and Wilkes-Barre through the southern tier of New York State, touching Binghamton, Endicott, and Auburn. It was not glamorous territory by any standard measure. It was enormously profitable territory by every standard that mattered. When Joseph Barbara, his predecessor and mentor, died in June 1959, the Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia, recognized Bufalino as the official boss of the northeastern Pennsylvania crime family. This was not a surprise to anyone inside the organization. Bufalino had been the operational power in the region for years. What the outside world knew about him was almost nothing. An FBI dossier from the 1950s described him as one of the two most powerful men in the Mafia of the Pittston area. A U.S. Senate committee, in the early 1960s, described him as one of the most violent and influential members of organized crime in the country. Neither assessment reached the general public. He did not appear in the newspapers. He did not hold press conferences. He had a restaurant in Manhattan, the Vesuvius, and New York mob bosses visited him there. In November of 1957, Bufalino organized what would become the most consequential mistake in the history of American organized crime, not because anything went wrong at his end, but because everything went wrong at the most public possible moment. He arranged a national gathering of mob bosses from across the country at Joseph Barbara's estate in Appalachian, New York. 58 godfathers came. State police raided the meeting. Bufalino was arrested along with the others, caught leaving in a car that also contained Vito Genovese, boss of the most powerful New York family. He was later released on appeal. The Appalachian meeting exposed the national structure of the American Mafia, to a degree that J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent years publicly denying the existence of organized crime, could no longer ignore. Bufalino's nicknames accumulated over the years: the Quiet Don, the Old Man, McGee. Each of them pointed to the same quality. He ran his empire from a brick house on a quiet street, and he never raised his voice, and he never had to, because the men who knew what he was capable of were always the men in the room. In February of 1961, Joe Gallo made the decision that would define the rest of his life, and he made it the only way he ever made decisions, which was to escalate before the other side had time to think. He and his brothers seized 4 of the Profaci organization's most senior figures in a single operation: Joseph Magliocco, Profaci's underboss; Frank Profaci, the boss's own brother; Captain Salvatore Musacchia; soldier John Simoni. They were taken and held at the dormitory on President Street. Profaci himself had been tipped off and flew to Florida before they could get to him. The demand was straightforward: a larger share of the family's proceeds in exchange for the hostages' release. Joe Gallo reportedly wanted to kill one of them first and demand $100,000 before any negotiation began. His brother Larry overruled him. What came instead was a negotiation conducted by Profaci's consigliere, Charles Lo Cicero, which resulted in a peace agreement and the peaceful release of all 4 men. Profaci had no intention of honoring any of it. The war that followed was the specific, ugly kind of war that happens when 2 sides know each other's addresses and have nothing left to lose. Carmine Persico, who had once worked alongside Gallo in the Anastasia killing, had by now switched his allegiance entirely. In the Sahara Club of East Flatbush, Persico and a Profaci soldier named Salvatore D'Ambrosio attempted to strangle Larry Gallo with a piece of rope. A police sergeant walked in to check on the noise and interrupted them. Larry survived. Gallo was arrested toward the end of 1961, not for the kidnapping or the war, but for extorting a bar owner, a charge that resulted in a conviction for conspiracy and extortion. The sentence was 7 to 14 years in prison. The judge told Gallo at sentencing that he had an utter contempt for the law and was a menace to society. This was accurate. What happened next was a specific compounding irony that characterized everything the Gallo brothers touched. While Joe sat in prison, the commission intervened in the family's leadership crisis. Profaci died of cancer in June 1962. His successor, Joseph Magliocco, the same man the Gallos had kidnapped, was deposed by the commission after he was found to have participated in a separate assassination conspiracy against other family bosses. The commission, in a move that would later seem to contain a dark joke, awarded the family to Joseph Colombo, a Brooklyn-born capo who had once been among the hostages the Gallos had seized. The family was renamed the Colombo Crime Family. A peace agreement between the Gallos and the new Colombo organization was negotiated in 1963 by New England family boss Raymond Patriarca. It settled the outstanding grievances and established new terms. Gallo, from his prison cell, refused to accept it. He cited his imprisonment as grounds. The war had ended without him, on terms he had not approved, and the man who had tried to kill his brother was now more powerful than ever. Gallo was incarcerated at 3 New York State institutions over the course of his sentencing: Greenhaven Correctional Facility, Attica Correctional Facility, and Auburn Correctional Facility. Each one had its own particular texture of violence and deprivation, and Gallo moved through all 3 with the same refusal to be contained by other people's expectations of who he was supposed to be in there. At Attica, a white supremacist whom Gallo had offended by refusing to join any of the prison's gangs tossed a burning cross into his cell. Gallo's strategy throughout his imprisonment was the same. He associated with whomever he chose, regardless of what the hierarchies of prison culture demanded. He sat with black inmates. He played cards with whoever was available. He refused to align himself with the organized racial structures of prison life, which made him dangerous to everyone and allied with no one, which was exactly the position he preferred. What he did instead of alliance was red. The accounts vary on the specific number, but multiple sources describe Gallo reading 6 to 8 books a day in prison, burning through history, philosophy, art, and politics with the focused intensity of a man who had finally found the thing his mind was built for. He discovered Nietzsche. He read the existentialists, Camus, Sartre, the writers who argued that meaning was something a man constructed for himself rather than received from the world. He had based his public persona on Machiavelli's Prince before going to prison. In prison, he actually read it, along with most of the Western philosophical canon, and the relationship between those two facts, the pose and the genuine article, produced something genuinely unusual in the world he came from. He took up painting, working in oils in the prison yard at Attica. Other inmates stood behind him and offered their opinions on his progress, which was either a mark of his standing in that community or of their genuine curiosity about what he was making, or both. He became friends at Greenhaven with Leroy Barnes, known as Nicky, a black drug trafficker from Harlem. Gallo saw what most of the organized crime world had not yet recognized. The Harlem drug rackets were shifting toward black criminal organizations, and the Mafia's grip on that territory was loosening. He coached Barnes on how to upgrade and organize his operation. He predicted the shift years before it happened. His willingness to form these alliances, to treat black inmates as colleagues rather than as a lower caste, earned him a nickname from other white Mafia prisoners, the Criminal. It was not a compliment in that context. He wore it like one. In 1964, he filed a lawsuit against the New York Department of Corrections for cruel and unusual punishment, the specific punishment being retribution for allowing a black barber to cut his hair. The lawsuit made the papers. Gallo was not trying to be a civil rights figure. He was being exactly who he was, a man who did whatever he chose and was willing to go on record about it. At Greenhaven, a riot broke out. Gallo stood in front of the crowd and demanded they stop the violence and return to their cells. He was not popular enough to be entirely persuasive, but he was connected enough to walk away from the confrontation intact, taking a prison guard as a hostage in the process. The administration was grateful enough to reduce his sentence. He walked out of that gate on April 11th, 1971, thin as a rail in a world that had changed around him, carrying 10 years of rage and 10 years of philosophy, and absolutely no intention of letting either one go to waste. Within weeks of his release, Gallo discovered that the world had something it had never previously offered him. It was interested in him. The comedian and novelist Jimmy Breslin had published a book in 1969 called The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, a satirical novel about a Gallo-like Brooklyn mob crew. It was made into a film in 1971, with the actor Jerry Orbach playing a character named Kid Sally Palumbo, a surrogate for Gallo. Gallo had seen the film and found the portrayal demeaning. He sought out Orbach to discuss it. What followed was not the confrontation Orbach might reasonably have expected. They had dinner. They talked. They became friends. Orbach's wife, Marta, said afterward that Gallo had absolutely charmed her. This was a specific quality that the Greenwich Village world found irresistible in the spring and summer of 1971. Here was a man who had spent a decade in prison becoming a genuine intellectual, who could hold a conversation about existentialism and then describe, with the same casual fluency, what it felt like to be on the wrong end of a Brooklyn street war. He was, in the cultural vernacular of the era, authentic in a way that writers and actors and comedians found compelling. Orbach introduced him to the broader social world of New York's creative class. The circle expanded. The actress Joan Hackett, the comedian David Steinberg, the writer Peter Stone, the actor Ben Gazzara. Gallo moved from President Street to an apartment in Greenwich Village so he could live closer to this world, and the man who had kept a lion in his basement and modeled himself on a film character was now walking into Sardi's, the famous theater district restaurant, and watching, according to his wife Sina, the room go quiet when he came in. Gay Talese, who had been writing about this world for years, assessed Gallo with a precision that captured something true. He almost became one of the beautiful people. Almost because underneath the dinners and the philosophy discussions in the village apartment, the streets-running red world had not released him, and had no intention of doing so. from the day he left prison and demanded $100,000 from the Colombo leadership as the price of staying out of their business. There had been a contract on his life. In the summer of 1971, he met a woman named Sina Essery in the elevator of their apartment building. She was 29 years old, an actress, a former nun. She later described her first impression of him as a man with a retinue of bodyguards who appeared extremely frail and pale, not the figure of danger she might have expected. What she found instead, over the weeks and months that followed, was something she had not anticipated. He could talk about art, theater, politics, philosophy, she said, all the things he had been reading about in prison. They married in March of 1972. Gallo became the stepfather to Sina's daughter Lisa, who was 10 years old. The wedding was 3 weeks before his birthday, 3 weeks before the Copacabana, 3 weeks before the Clam house on Mulberry Street. 3 weeks after the wedding, on the night of April 6th, 1972, Joe Gallo put on his pinstripe suit and his gray fedora and climbed into his black Cadillac to celebrate the birthday he would not survive. While Joe Gallo was building his new life in Greenwich Village, the man who controlled his criminal world was doing something that no mafia boss before him had done, which was to hold press conferences about it. Joseph Colombo was born on June 16, 1923, in Brooklyn, the son of a man who had been an early member of the Profaci crime family. He had followed his father into that world, becoming one of the family's top enforcers and eventually one of its most capable operators. The commission had awarded him the family in 1963 after Magliocco's deposition as a reward for Colombo's loyalty in exposing a conspiracy against the commission leadership. He inherited a family that had been torn apart by the Gallo Wars, rebuilt it with patience and with the particular gift he had for managing relationships, and brought it for a few years to something approaching stability. But Colombo was unlike any boss who had preceded him in a specific consequential way. He could not resist the spotlight. In April of 1970, after his son was charged with melting coins for resale as silver ingots, Colombo responded by organizing a public protest, sending picketers to FBI headquarters in Manhattan to demonstrate against what he called the harassment of Italian Americans by federal law enforcement. The protest grew. He founded the Italian American Civil Rights League, framing it as a civil rights organization dedicated to combating stereotypes about people of Italian descent. The league grew to over 100,000 members. Colombo appeared on television. He spoke at fundraisers. He negotiated with the producers of The Godfather, convincing them to remove the words Mafia and Cosa Nostra from the script in exchange for his organization's cooperation with filming in New York. He was the most publicly visible mafia boss in American history, and the other families despised him for it. When Gallo was released from prison in April 1971, Colombo and acting consigliere Joseph Iacovelli offered him a peace meeting and $1,000 as a homecoming settlement. Gallo told them he was not bound by the 1963 peace agreement he had refused to accept from his prison cell, and he demanded $100,000 to leave the Colombo organization's operations undisturbed. Colombo refused. Acting boss Vincenzo Alloy issued the order, "Kill Gallo." Gallo walked through Greenwich Village with a contract on his life from that day forward. On June 28, 1971, Colombo convened the second annual Italian Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle. The crowd numbered in the tens of thousands, an extraordinary public demonstration of the League's reach. As Colombo prepared to speak, a 24-year-old man from Newark named Jerome Johnson, posing as a news photographer with a League-issued press pass, approached him and fired 3 shots at close range into his head and neck. Colombo's bodyguards killed Johnson immediately. Colombo survived the shooting but was permanently paralyzed. He would linger in that paralyzed state for 7 years, dying of cardiac arrest on May 22, 1978, at the age of 54. The police investigated. They interviewed Gallo. They concluded that Johnson had acted alone, with no organizational ties. That was the official finding. The Colombo family's internal verdict was the opposite. Gallo had spent a decade in prison cultivating black allies. Johnson was black. The connection felt not merely possible but certain to the men who ran that organization. The contract on Gallo's life, already in place, became something closer to an obligation. A second theory also circulated, and circulates still. Johnson had spent time at a Gambino club in the days before the shooting. Gambino had publicly clashed with Colombo. The theory that Gambino organized the shooting to remove a boss who had become a liability is documented, examined, and officially unresolved. Both theories remain exactly that. Whatever Jerome Johnson's actual instructions had been, the Colombo family had reached its verdict, and the verdict was that Joe Gallo had a debt to pay, and they intended to collect it. But there was another version of the story, one that came out decades later from a dying man in a nursing home in Philadelphia, and it began not with a mob war in Brooklyn, but with a truck broken down on a highway in upstate New York in 1955. Francis Joseph Sheeran was born on October 25th, 1920 in Philadelphia, of Irish and Swedish descent. He was a World War II veteran, 6 feet 4 inches tall, approximately 248 pounds, a man built on a scale that made rooms feel smaller. After the war, he became a truck driver and a Teamsters Union official in the Philadelphia area, and in 1955, on a highway near Endicott in upstate New York, his truck broke down. A man stopped to help. The man offered to fix the truck and then offered something else, an introduction to a way of earning money that had nothing to do with driving trucks. The man who stopped was Russell Bufalino. Bufalino brought Sheeran into his world gradually and deliberately. He introduced him to Philadelphia crime boss Angelo Bruno. He introduced him to his cousin, the attorney William Bufalino, who was the longtime legal counsel for Teamsters president Jimmy Hoffa. Through these introductions, Sheeran became, over the course of the late 1950s and the 1960s, an enforcer with documented ties to the Bufalino organization, a Teamsters official who served Bufalino's interests within the union structure, and, according to his own account given before his death, a hitman who carried out murders at Bufalino's direction. The relationship between Bufalino and Hoffa ran through Sheeran as a kind of hinge. Hoffa needed someone who could manage the violent end of his union business. Bufalino needed someone inside the Teamsters who was loyal to him. Sheeran served both purposes, and for years the arrangement functioned. Bufalino, according to those who observed him, described Sheeran as one of the 2 greatest men he had ever met. By the spring of 1972, Russell Bufalino was 68 years old and had been running his organization for over a decade from the brick house on Dorrance Street. The 5 families of New York sought his counsel. The Pennsylvania Crime Commission's later assessment would describe his family as possibly the most powerful Cosa Nostra organization in the Commonwealth. A U.S. Senate committee had described him, years earlier, as one of the most violent and influential members of organized crime in the country. None of this was visible in any newspaper. None of it was visible in any public record. The man himself was not visible, which was exactly how he intended it. According to Frank Sheeran, speaking to author Charles Brandt in the years before his death in 2003, the evening of April 6, 1972, brought Bufalino and Gallo into the same room at the Copacabana. During the birthday celebration, Gallo was rude to Bufalino, in a way and to a degree that Bufalino did not forgive. Bufalino gave Sheeran a nod. Sheeran, who understood exactly what that meant, was told by informants within the Gallo circle not only which restaurant the party would move to after the Copacabana closed, but exactly where Gallo would be sitting when he arrived. Sheeran claims he entered Umberto's alone, presenting himself as a working truck driver stopping in for a late meal, and committed the killing himself as the sole gunman. This version of events reached millions through I Heard You, Paint Houses, and The Irishman, but the evidence points somewhere else. Witnesses described multiple short Italian gunmen. Police descriptions matched that. FBI memos named Carmine DiBiase and Philip Gambino. Gallo's own bodyguard identified DiBiase at the scene. Frank Sheeran didn't fit any of it. Investigators, journalists, and former insiders have all reached the same conclusion. Sheeran wasn't there. As for Russell Bufalino, His connection rests on a single, unproven claim, and that's where it stays. A question without an answer, one that never stops being asked. The record shows this. Joseph Luparelli was sitting at the bar when Joe Gallo walked in, and in that moment, the night was already over. Luparelli wasn't important. A low-level associate, a driver, a man with a cane. But he recognized Gallo, and he knew there was an open contract on his life. He didn't finish his drink. He left. 2 blocks away, he found Joseph Iacovelli. The response was immediate. Clip Joey. Within minutes, the pieces were in place. Carmine DiBiase, a known killer. Others known only as Cisco and Benny. Guns passed out. Cars positioned outside. Inside the restaurant, nothing had changed. Gallo's table was ordering more food, talking, sitting with their backs to the wall. Outside, it was already decided. The side door opened, and DiBiase walked in. The first shot hit before anyone could react. Gallo moved instantly, not blindly, but with instinct. He flipped the table for cover, drew his gun, and fired back. The room filled with gunfire, around 20 shots tearing through a restaurant that had been open only 2 months. 3 bullets hit him. He kept moving. He pushed toward the door, drawing fire away from the table where his wife and family sat. Whether it was instinct, survival, or protection, it was all happening at once. He made it outside. On the corner of Mulberry and Hester, he collapsed in the street beside his black car, covered in civil rights stickers. Police arrived within moments. He was rushed to the hospital. He was pronounced dead soon after. The men who shot him were already gone. Joe Gallo, born April 7th, 1929, died on April 7th, 1972. 43 years old, on his birthday. 3 days after his death, Joe Gallo lay in an open coffin under police watch. His sister leaned over and said, "The streets are going to run red with blood." She was right. Revenge came fast and wrong. A gunman walked into a Manhattan restaurant, opened fire, and killed 2 innocent men. The targets walked away untouched. No one was ever charged. That's what the war became. Not justice, not revenge, just chaos. The man believed to have ordered Gallo's murder fled. The main suspect disappeared. Witnesses couldn't be trusted. The case collapsed. The war dragged on. More men died. By 1974, it ended, not with victory but absorption. Gallo's crew vanished into another family, and the killing that started it all? Unsolved, unanswered, still open. After his death, something changed. Joe Gallo became a myth. In 1974, a film called Crazy Joe tried to tell his story. A few years later, Bob Dylan wrote Joey, an 11-minute ballad that painted him not as a gangster, but as an underdog, almost a hero. It was the moment, the early 1970s, when distrust of institutions was high, and a Brooklyn gangster who quoted philosophy could be seen as something more. Gallo hadn't changed, but the world looking at him had. And in death, he became something he never was in life. Joseph Colombo died on May 22, 1978, 7 years after being shot, paralyzed, and left unable to speak or move. Russell Bufalino was imprisoned twice, first in 1978 and again in 1981. He died in 1994 at 90, quietly, as he had lived. Frank Sheeran died in 2003. Joe Gallo's story isn't just about crime, it's about a trap. He came out of prison transformed, reading philosophy, painting, moving through Greenwich Village, marrying a former nun. For a moment he became someone new, but the world he came from didn't care. The Colombo family still believed he had tried to kill their boss. The contract on his life never went away. On April 7th, 1972, his birthday, he sat down at Umberto's. The food arrived. The night ended. He was shot on the sidewalk in a pinstripe suit. Whether Russell Bufalino played a role is never proven, but the contrast is clear. Bufalino survived by staying invisible. Gallo died because he couldn't. No one was ever convicted. The case remains unsolved, And after more than 50 years, it still is. Like the video, subscribe, and click the next file. This story goes deeper.